This is a lecture on climate and climate change from a forestry and natural resource management perspective. So just like weather is almost a given, its importance in what we do in natural resource management, so is climate. Climate obviously is probably the first determinant on what types of ecosystems can exist in particular places. In addition, the fact that climate is changing now more rapidly than it has since humans have been on the planet, that's probably the central challenge for natural resource management during your and your kids' and grandkids' careers. So this is certainly a topic worth talking about. So what is climate? I think we all pretty much know what climate is relative to weather. I think the definition that I'll use is just climate is the long-term average of weather in a location. Long term, that can vary. When we're talking about instrument records, sometimes this may just be a few decades. When we look at long-term averages, we're often looking at averages from, for instance, a particular weather station in some location, and a lot of those weather stations, were first installed in the 1960s or 1970s. Certainly there are very old weather stations that maybe have been around more than a century, but those are rare. So in terms of instrumental records, we're talking about decades. We're talking about qualitative records and human habitation and so on. We're usually talking about centuries. So climate is the long-term average of weather in a particular location. How do we characterize climate? There are many ways to characterize or describe climate. You can use long-term average precipitation, long-term average temperature for a particular location. I'm just going to talk about two that you'll run into a lot. One of them is the Köppen, I should have two dots over that, climate classification. This uses either 2 or 3 letters to describe climate in a particular location. The first capital letter is in this column, and it indicates sort of both location and general climate, whether it's tropical, dry, temperate, continental, or polar. The second main group is the precipitation subgroup. So within each of the main groups, there's a subgroup that describes the precipitation regime. So for instance, some of these are seasonal. So tropical savanna, but that varies depending on whether the savanna has a dry season in the winter or a dry season in the summer, for instance. And then for some of the classifications, tropical is always warm, but for some of the locations, there's an additional classification to indicate, for instance, in dry climates, is it a generally hot or generally cold climate? So for instance, I believe, in the southeastern United States, we're temperate, dry winter, warm summer. CWB is our Köppen classification. And because of all those letter combinations, then you can have a fair degree of granularity then in how you describe climate conditions. So, for instance, in the western United States, with all of its mountainous areas, even over a relatively regional area, you can see that there are a number of different climate classifications describe depending on precipitation and temperature variation due to elevation in that case. Whereas some zones, such as the northern African deserts and Middle Eastern deserts, basically are this dry tropical climate. So that's the Köppen classification, and you'll run into that in a lot of different situations. Another type of classification are climate diagrams that basically diagram weather variables, mainly temperature and precipitation, but sometimes other weather variables, averaged over long periods of time in a graphical way that you can look at it and pretty quickly get a sense of the general climate regime represented by that diagram. This description here is generally associated with the Walter climate diagrams, and this is sort of how they're structured. So there's information in text in the upper part of the diagram, which shows where we are, latitude, longitude, elevation, country, and city we're talking about. Sometimes they'll show the annual averages for precipitation, and in this case, for instance, they're saying they can show how long the weather observations were that go into the averages here. Average of temperature and annual precipitation. And then on the graph, they present usually in monthly averages. There's 12 dots for each of these lines. The monthly average temperature. So this red curve is monthly average temperature, and the blue is monthly average precipitation. Okay, so you can see the average seasonal variation in temperature and precipitation. The precipitation and temperature axes are both in metric, so the temperature is in Celsius, the precipitation is in millimeters of precipitation for that particular month. And they're scaled in a standard way. So precipitation is scaled so that it's twice, that millimeter scale is twice the degrees centigrade scale. So you can see the temperature here is scaled to 50 degrees C, and the precipitation is scaled to 100 millimeters. And the reason those have to be scaled in a standard way is because the way these temperature and precipitation graphs interact also tell us something about wet and dry seasons. So in general, during months when that average precipitation line is above the average temperature line, that's usually adequate moisture. So these periods are, adequate moisture for plant growth. Whereas when the temperature exceeds the precipitation line for those months, those are the dry months. The other point is that the summer is always in the middle in these graphs. So the seasons are arranged in a standard way. Obviously in the southern hemisphere then you would have June and July on the edges and December in the middle. Whereas in the northern hemisphere we have June and July in the middle and December and January on the ends. But what that does, it allows summer to always be in the middle. So just at a glance, you can look at a climate diagram and say, oh, this is a climate with a moist spring and fall and winter and a dry summer. So that's useful information. So these are examples of climate diagrams for a few locations that many of us will be familiar with. This is Walter climate diagram for Gainesville, Florida. The format's a little different here. It depends on what's generated it. I generated these with a website called climatecharts.org. Cool website to check out. It has a big map. You can just click on any place in the map and it will generate a climate diagram for you for that map. But what you can see here, our precipitation is scaled to temperature. So 100 millimeters precipitation, 50 degrees centigrade here. Here's our average monthly temperature line, and our average monthly precipitation line is always above that annual temperature line. So throughout all of the year, soil moisture is on average adequate for plant growth. But at a glance we can see, oh, it's a little drier in April and May and in November and December. So our dry months in Gainesville are in late spring and in the fall. Okay, I chose a contrasting climate diagram here. This is for Las Vegas. Las Vegas is in the desert. You can see it has the same scales, temperature and precipitation scales as Gainesville, but look at that precipitation scale. It's in the desert. Their annual precipitation sum is about 1/10 of what it is in Gainesville, Florida, even though the mean temperature I think is about the same, which is interesting. So throughout all months of the year, the precipitation, average monthly precipitation line is below the average monthly temperature line, and that means it's dry all year. Well, yeah, it's the desert, so that's what we would expect. And this finally is for Hoquiam, Washington, which is on the Olympic Peninsula in the Pacific Northwest. Another contrasting climate classification here. You can see same scale as the previous two graphs, 50 degrees C and 100 millimeters precipitation, but you note they're using this basically break in the graph to go up to 300 millimeters because there are some months in the winter when precipitation is actually much higher than during the rest of the year. So a couple things then. You can see there are no dry months. The average monthly precipitation is always above the average monthly temperature line. Very wet in the winters and much drier in the summer. So this is sort of a classic Mediterranean climate. I looked up the Köppen climate classifications for these three sites. So the Köppen for Gainesville here was CFA, which is temperate zone. C is temperate, no dry season, and hot summer. Certainly hot summer, we know that. Okay, Las Vegas is BWH. So it's dry. B is the dry classification. W is arid desert. H is hot. Yeah, no big surprise there, right? And then Hoquiam, Washington is in the CSB. CSB classification, where C is temperate. S is dry summer. Yeah, we can see that. And then B is warm summer. Okay, it's pleasant, at least during the summer, up in the Pacific Northwest. So, different ways to look at climate, different ways to characterize them. We have one more thing to look at here. I thought this is a pretty wild figure. This is from the original book where Walter published information on his climate diagrams that he developed, and he has big maps of each continent with climate diagrams from across the continent. And it's sort of neat because you can look at just this map and sort of at a glance, see the variation in temperature and water availability and how that varies seasonally. So, for instance, here in the Pacific Northwest, we can see those dry summers. Here in the desert regions, you can see all these shaded areas that represent dry conditions. Here in the east, you can see that for the most part, there's adequate moisture, and these are all forested regions here in the east. So these, Walter climate diagrams are pretty cool because they can tell you a lot just in a glance.